My name is Lily. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the quiet one, the dependable one, the person people describe as solid, as low maintenance, or easy to rely on. I live a fairly ordinary life on the surface. No dramatic entrances, no loud opinions, no habit of asking for help unless I've already tried everything else first. People usually underestimate me because I don't perform strength. I don't talk about sacrifice while I'm making it. I don't announce how much I give or what it costs me. I learned early that being calm makes others comfortable. And when people are comfortable, they stop looking too closely. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone or winning some imaginary argument years too late. It's about clarity, about what happens when you quietly carry weight for so long that everyone forgets it's heavy, and what happens when one day you simply set it down. For 12 years, I was the person my family leaned on financially. Not officially. There was never a meeting, never a label. It just happened gradually, and "Are you able to help this once?" that turned into a role no one questioned again. I didn't call it generosity, I called it responsibility. I told myself that this is what stable people do for the people they love. I was the family's emergency fund for 12 years. They disappeared when I lost my job, and the smallest detail still echoes the loudest. The group chat went silent the same day my income stopped. This isn't a story about sudden betrayal, no slammed doors, no screaming phone calls. It's about absence, about the slow, almost polite withdrawal of attention, warmth, and connection once my usefulness disappeared. It's about realizing that being needed and being valued are not the same thing, and that confusing the two can quietly cost you years of your life. Over the next parts, I'll walk you through how this dynamic formed, how I normalized things I shouldn't have, and how silence, mine and theirs, became the most important language in the room. There's no villain monologue coming, no dramatic gotcha moment, just a series of choices made calmly that changed the direction of my life in a way no one else saw coming. I'm telling this now not to ask for sympathy, but to offer recognition. Because if you've ever been the reliable one, the fixer, the invisible safety net, there's a chance some part of this will feel uncomfortably familiar. Before we begin, let me ask you one gentle question. Have you ever wondered who you'd be to people if you stopped being useful? For a long time, I didn't have a name in my family so much as a function. I was the one you called after things went wrong. Not in panic, never panic. More like certainty. The way you reach for a light switch in a dark room, already knowing where it is, that was me. Predictable, reliable, quietly available. If someone had asked my family to describe me, they would have said kind things. They always did. Lily's responsible. Lily's good with money. Lily doesn't mind helping. None of those statements was untrue, but they were incomplete in a way that mattered. I wasn't the dramatic one. I wasn't the favorite. I didn't bring chaos or excitement into rooms. I brought solutions, and solutions don't get remembered once they work. It started small, the way these things always do. A late rent payment here, a medical bill there, a short-term loan that turned into, "Don't worry, I'll pay you back when things settle." Things never really settled, but I did. I adjusted, I made space, I told myself it was temporary, even as the pattern became permanent. No one ever sat me down and said, "You are now the family's emergency fund." It was more subtle than that. My number was saved, my availability is assumed. My boundaries were left unexamined because I didn't announce them loudly enough to be noticed. And I didn't see myself as a victim. That's important. I didn't feel exploited. I felt useful, needed, trusted. There's a quiet pride that comes with being the one people rely on, especially when you've built your life around being capable. At family gatherings, I was rarely the center of attention. I hovered at the edges of conversations, refilling drinks, listening more than speaking. When money came up, people joked lightly about how I was the organized one, how I'd figure it out. I laughed too. It was easier than explaining the weight of always being expected to land on your feet, so others don't have to. If someone else struggled, it was a crisis. When I did, it was a surprise, almost an inconvenience. I remember one Thanksgiving when my cousin casually mentioned a credit card issue at the table. Before she even finished her sentence, my aunt looked at me, not with urgency, with relief, as if my presence alone had already solved the problem. No one asked if I could help. They asked how I'd like to do it. I said yes, I usually did. Not because I was afraid to say no, but because saying no felt like changing the rules mid-game. And I didn't realize the rules had never been fair to begin with. Over time, my role solidified. I wasn't consulted on big family decisions, but I was looped in when something needed funding. I wasn't asked how I was doing, but people assumed I was fine. I had a steady job, after all. I didn't complain. I didn't ask. I didn't disrupt the story they'd written for me. The story was simple. Lily is stable. Lily will handle it. Lily doesn't need much. And the dangerous thing about being seen as low need is that your absence doesn't register as a loss until it's already gone. I didn't keep track of how much I gave, not because I didn't care, but because caring would have forced me to confront something uncomfortable. That generosity without reciprocity eventually turns into expectation. An expectation, once normalized, is invisible. Looking back, I can see how carefully I trained everyone around me. Every time I smoothed things over, every time I said, "It's fine." Every time I absorbed the inconvenience quietly so no one else had to feel it. I thought I was building goodwill. What I was really building was a version of myself that existed only in relation to other people's needs. And the strange thing is, no one asked me to be that person. I volunteered, because at the time it felt like love. The first moment I remember wasn't dramatic enough to deserve a reaction. That's probably why it stayed with me. It happened on a weekday evening, nothing special about it. I was sitting at my kitchen table, laptop still open from work, when my phone buzzed. A message in the family group chat. My sister had sent a screenshot of an overdraft notice. No context, no greeting. Just the image, followed by a single line. "Can you help cover this until Friday?" I remember staring at the screen longer than necessary. Not because of the amount. It wasn't large. It never was at first. What caught my attention was the tone, the assumption. There was no, "Are you okay too?" No, I hate to ask. Just a quiet expectation wrapped in casual familiarity. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I replied with a simple, "Sure, I'll send it now." I didn't ask questions. I didn't ask what happened. I didn't ask how she was doing. That part still bothers me, how quickly I stepped into the role without checking if it was one I still wanted. The money left my account within minutes. What didn't come was a follow-up. No, thank you that night. No check-in the next day. Friday passed, then Monday. When the money was eventually returned weeks later, it arrived without explanation, folded neatly into the normal flow of conversation as if nothing unusual had happened. That should have been the end of it, but something in me noticed the absence where gratitude usually lived. It wasn't that I needed praise. It was the quiet realization that my help had shifted categories, from favor to function, from something offered to something expected. And once something is expected, acknowledgement starts to feel optional. I mentioned it to no one. I didn't want to seem sensitive, or worse, self-centered. Families aren't transactional, I reminded myself. You don't keep score. You don't ask for emotional receipts when you help people you love. So I filed the feeling away, gave it a name like overthinking, and let it go. Then it happened again. Another request, another assumption, this time from my uncle. He didn't even message me directly, just replied, "Lily can help," in a thread where others were discussing a problem. I found out because someone tagged me with a thumbs up emoji. I remember smiling at my phone, that polite, practiced smile you use when something goes wrong, but you don't want to disrupt the room. I typed back, "Yes, I can take care of it." No one asked if I wanted to. Later that night, I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to explain to myself why it felt different. I wasn't stretched thin, I wasn't angry, but there was a faint sting, like realizing someone had crossed a boundary you hadn't known was there until it was already behind you. The cut was small, almost clean, easy to ignore. What made it worse was how invisible it was to everyone else. At the next family dinner, no one mentioned it. The conversation flowed easily. Laughter, stories. Someone joked about how lucky we were to have Lily. I smiled again, nodded, took another bite of food I couldn't taste. That night, driving home, I turned the radio off and sat in the quiet longer than usual. I tried to imagine what would happen if I didn't respond next time. Not dramatically, just slowly, if I took a few hours, a day. The thought made me uncomfortable. Not because of the potential consequences, but because of how conditioned I was to immediate compliance. That's when I realized the first cut hadn't been financial at all. It had been psychological. A tiny shift in how I was seen and how easily I accepted it. I didn't bleed. I didn't cry. I didn't confront anyone. I just noticed. And once you notice something like that, it's very hard to unsee. After the first few moments, it became easier not to react. That's the quiet danger of small cuts. They don't demand attention. They invite adaptation. What once felt slightly off began to feel familiar. Requests arrived without context. Deadlines were assumed. Explanations were optional. Gratitude, when it appeared, sounded more like relief than appreciation. I told myself this was just how things worked now. That closeness breeds informality, that people are less careful with those they trust. I became very good at explaining things away. If someone forgot to pay me back, I reminded myself that they were stressed. If someone joked about my safety net energy, I laughed along. If a conversation turned toward money and all eyes drifted in my direction, I straightened my posture and prepared to be useful. There's a strange comfort in predictability, even when it costs you. I started noticing how differently people spoke to me compared to others. When someone else helped, it was framed as a favor. When I helped, it was framed as a solution, a resource, something closer to infrastructure than a person. Just send Lily the details. Lily will know what to do. We'll check with Lily. No pause, no consent. I didn't correct them. I told myself that pushing back would feel petty, or ungrateful, or dramatic. I had built a reputation on being calm, and calm people don't suddenly start asking for emotional consideration. So I stayed quiet. What I didn't realize was that silence, repeated often enough, becomes confirmation. The group chat reflected the shift perfectly. Messages to me became shorter, more functional, less personal. Birthdays were still acknowledged, but with generic emojis. When I shared something about my own life, an exhausting week, a small personal win, it was often met with a reaction and then quickly buried under someone else's crisis. And I let it happen. I told myself I didn't need the attention, that I was above needing reassurance, that maturity meant not expecting things in return. I wrapped my self-denial in language that sounded noble and responsible. But beneath that story was something more fragile. I was afraid that if I stopped being useful, I would become irrelevant. That fear didn't come from them. It came from me, from years of being rewarded, not with affection, but with reliance. From learning that the fastest way to matter was to solve something. So when the disrespect was repeated, I normalized it. I adjusted my expectations downward. I told myself this was adulthood, this was family, this was just how love looks when people are busy. There were moments when the pattern almost revealed itself, like the time I covered a major expense for a relative, and later overheard them say, "It wasn't a big deal. Lily's fine." Not grateful, not relieved, just fine. As if my stability erased the impact of the ask. I remember standing in the hallway, holding a glass of water, listening. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct them. I walked back into the room and joined the conversation like nothing had happened. That's the thing about normalized disrespect. It doesn't announce itself as cruelty. It presents as comfort, familiarity, efficiency. And once everyone is comfortable with your overextension, your boundaries start to look like inconveniences. I became careful about what I shared, not consciously at first. I just noticed that when I talked about being tired or uncertain, the room went quiet in a different way, as if my vulnerability didn't fit the version of me they depended on. So I stopped offering it. I started keeping parts of myself private, not as a strategy, but as a form of self-preservation I didn't yet have language for. I became more observant, less reactive. I watched how quickly conversations shifted when my usefulness wasn't relevant. And I kept saying yes, because saying yes maintained the equilibrium. It kept the peace. It preserved the role I had been assigned, even though no one had ever formally discussed it with me. What I didn't understand then was that every unchallenged assumption hardens into entitlement. And entitlement, once it settles in, doesn't feel like abuse. It feels like normal. By the time I realized how skewed things had become, the imbalance was no longer a moment. It was a system, and I was the one holding it up. There's a moment when patterns stop feeling accidental. It doesn't arrive with clarity or anger. It arrives quietly, like recognizing your reflection in a window you've passed 100 times before. One day, you don't just see movement, you see yourself. For me, that moment came during a conversation I wasn't meant to be part of. We were gathered at my parents' house, the kind of weekend visit that blends into every other one. People were in different rooms, talking over each other, the television murmuring in the background. I was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes that weren't mine, when I heard my name from the living room. Not sharply, casually. "Lily doesn't really need anything," someone said. "She's good. She's always good." There was agreement, soft laughter, no malice, just certainty. I stood there with my hands in the sink, listening to the version of myself being described, a version that felt flatter than the one I lived in. Someone uncomplicated, self-sufficient, to the point of invisibility. That was when it clicked. I wasn't seen as generous. I was seen as available. I wasn't the helper. I was the backup plan. Once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it everywhere. The way decisions were made without me, until they needed funding. The way my opinion was optional, but my support was assumed. The way people expressed concern for others' stress, while treating my composure as proof that I didn't feel strain at all. I had been assigned a role, and I had played it so well that no one questioned whether I wanted it. Reliable, useful, invisible. That combination is seductive, especially for people who don't want conflict. You get praise for being easy. You get rewarded with trust that doesn't require intimacy. You become essential, but not cherished. And the hardest part was realizing that I had helped write the script. Every time I stepped in early, so no one else had to struggle. Every time I said, "It's fine, don't worry about it." Every time I downplayed my own needs to keep things smooth. I taught people how to treat me, not out of weakness, but out of a belief that love meant stability. But stability, without boundaries, turns into extraction. I started paying attention to how often my role was invoked in my absence, how plans accounted for my support before I'd even been asked, how concern for me only appeared if it threatened the system, if I seemed unavailable, distracted, or slow to respond. Once, when I didn't reply to a message for several hours, someone followed up with, "Everything okay? We need to know if you can handle this. Are you okay? But can you still perform your function?" That was the moment I stopped pretending I didn't understand. I realized something else too. No one was being intentionally cruel. This wasn't a story of villains. It was a story of convenience. People organizing their lives around the most stable point in the room and forgetting that stability comes from effort. And I had been quiet about that effort for so long that it became invisible, even to me. That's what roles do when you don't question them. They harden, they simplify you, they erase complexity in favor of reliability. I began to feel a strange distance during interactions, like I was observing myself from the outside, watching how easily I slipped into problem-solving mode, how rarely anyone asked what I wanted. I didn't confront anyone, not yet. I was still processing the realization that the role I had accepted wasn't neutral. It came with expectations I had never agreed to, and consequences I would eventually have to face. Because once you are no longer seen as a person with fluctuating capacity, stepping back doesn't look like self-care. It looks like failure, and that thought stayed with me, quietly. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment anyone else would recognize as important. That's what made it unmistakable to me. When something changes without noise, it's usually internal and usually permanent. It was the day I lost my job, not dramatically. No scandal. No warning signs anyone else could point to and say, "Of course." Just a restructuring email sent early in the morning, written in careful language meant to soften the blow. My role was being eliminated. I was thanked for my contributions. I was wished well. I closed my laptop and sat there longer than I expected to. I wasn't panicking. I had savings, a plan, a professional identity that didn't evaporate overnight. What unsettled me wasn't the loss itself, but the immediate awareness of what it would mean beyond my own life. I didn't tell anyone right away, not out of secrecy, out of curiosity. I wanted to feel the change before explaining it, to sit with it privately, to understand what exactly had shifted inside me. That afternoon, the family group chat lit up, a message about an unexpected expense, another screenshot, another casual ask. I stared at my phone and felt something new, stillness, not fear, not anger, just a pause where my automatic response used to be. The familiar impulse to fix it rose, and then stopped as if it had hit a wall. For the first time in years, I didn't answer immediately. I told myself I would respond later, that I needed time to think. I had just lost my job and was allowed to take a breath before solving someone else's problem. An hour passed, then two. The chat continued without me. Other messages, jokes, side comments. No one followed up with me directly. No one asked if I'd seen it. That was when the second shift happened. I realized how conditional my presence had become. When I was useful, I was summoned. When I was quiet, I disappeared seamlessly. The conversation didn't pause, it rerouted. I felt strangely calm. That evening, I went for a walk without my phone. Just around the neighborhood, the air was cool, ordinary. I watched people pass me, living lives that had nothing to do with my role in my family. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for years. What happens if I stop? Not permanently, not dramatically. Just stop stepping in first. Stop anticipating needs before they are spoken. Stop volunteering stability like it was a renewable resource. The answer unsettled me, but it also clarified something important. I had been confusing love with usefulness for a very long time. Later that night, I finally replied in the group chat. I kept it simple, neutral. "I can't help with this right now." No explanation, no apology. The response was almost immediate. "Oh, okay. Didn't know. Let us know if that changes." That was it. No follow-up, no concern, no curiosity. I put my phone down and felt something close to relief, because the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was revealing. In losing my job, I hadn't just lost income. I had lost the structure that allowed others to avoid seeing me as human. And without that structure, something in me refused to snap back into place. I didn't feel empowered, I felt honest. And honesty, I was learning, can be deeply disruptive, even when it's quiet. That night, I opened my old leather notebook, the one I'd kept since my 20s. I wrote a single sentence. I am allowed to exist without being useful. I didn't know yet what that would cost me, but I knew I wasn't going back. After that day, silence stopped being something that happened to me. It became something I chose. At first, it felt unfamiliar, like using a muscle I'd neglected for years. I had spent so long responding quickly, anticipating needs, filling gaps, that not doing so felt almost irresponsible. I caught myself reaching for my phone, ready to step in before remembering that I didn't have to. Nothing bad happened when I didn't. That was the first lesson. Requests still came, but differently now. Less confident, slightly more cautious. As if my pause had disrupted a pattern no one knew how to articulate. Hey, just checking. Are you free to help with something? Let me know if you're able. The language shifted subtly. Not kinder, just uncertain. I answered some messages. I declined others. I didn't justify myself either way. And something interesting happened. People began to misinterpret my quiet. They assumed I was overwhelmed, or embarrassed, or struggling privately. A few even offered surface-level concern, the kind that dissolves quickly if it doesn't lead to action. But no one asked directly what had changed. Silence, I learned, makes people uncomfortable, but only up to the point where it inconveniences them. After that, they create explanations that preserve their comfort. I watched this from a distance, not with bitterness, but with curiosity. When I stopped filling space, others filled it with assumptions. Some thought I was going through a phase. Some thought I was being sensitive. Some thought I would bounce back. What none of them considered was that my quiet might be intentional. I used the extra mental space to pay attention. I noticed how often conversations revolved around needs, not connection. How rarely anyone checked in unless there was a problem to solve. How my presence had once functioned as a buffer, absorbing stress so others didn't have to. Without that buffer, small tensions surfaced. I didn't intervene, and slowly people stopped reaching out unless it was necessary. The group chat became quieter for me. Not because it was inactive, but because I was no longer central to its function. Messages passed without tagging me. Problems were discussed without immediately assigning them to me. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt something more precise. I felt seen, not in the way people usually mean that word, but in the way patterns reveal truth when they're interrupted. In my absence, it became clear what my presence had been compensating for. And I realized something else too. Silence gave me leverage. Not because it was manipulative, but because it was honest. I wasn't withholding to punish anyone. I was conserving myself. That distinction mattered. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't explain my new limits. I let my behavior do the talking. And behavior, unlike words, doesn't invite debate. There were moments of discomfort. Family gatherings felt different. Conversations skimmed the surface. A few people tried to reestablish the old dynamic with jokes. Light comments about how I'd been off the grid or taking a break. I smiled politely, changed the subject. What I didn't do was reassure them, because reassurance would have put me back in the role of emotional stabilizer, the one who smooths over discomfort so others don't have to sit with it. I was done doing that. The longer I stayed quiet, the more apparent it became that my silence wasn't costing me connection. It was revealing the shape of it, and what I saw wasn't flattering. Relationships built on utility don't collapse when utility disappears. They simply go quiet. That's when I understood the power of not filling the gap. When you stop explaining, stop compensating, stop rescuing, people are forced to confront the reality of the relationship without your labor holding it together. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was just no longer performing. And in that space, something inside me began to reorganize. I didn't know yet what I was preparing for, but I knew I was no longer available by default. What no one noticed, because they had never needed to, was how observant I had become. Silence didn't make me passive, it made me precise. With fewer demands pulling at my attention, I started seeing the full architecture of the relationships I'd been maintaining, not just emotionally, but practically, financially, logistically. I could trace patterns now: who asked, how often, under what circumstances, and what happened when the answer wasn't immediate. I wasn't angry. Anger clouds judgment. What I felt instead was focus. For years, I had managed my own finances carefully out of necessity. I tracked everything, not obsessively, methodically. I had records of transfers, dates, and reasons given, not because I planned to use them against anyone, but because the order made me feel safe. Documentation was how I created stability in a world that assumed I would always provide it. No one ever asked how I knew exactly what I could afford to give. They assumed it came naturally. Now, for the first time, I looked at those records without guilt, without the lens of obligation. I looked at them as information. And information, I was learning, is a form of leverage, even when you never intend to use it publicly. I also began documenting conversations, not secretly, not obsessively, just clearly who said what, when expectations were implied, when responsibilities were quietly shifted in my direction. It was astonishing how much becomes visible when you stop participating. I noticed how certain people only reached out when something was wrong, how others vanished the moment help was unavailable, how a few hovered, checking in just enough to see if I had returned. They hadn't noticed that my silence wasn't withdrawal, it was preparation. I spent time learning things I had always postponed, not out of ambition, but out of self-respect. I reviewed my long-term financial structure, updated beneficiaries, clarified accounts that had been informally shared or referenced as family backup. I made sure that what was mine was clearly, unquestionably mine. I didn't tell anyone. There was no reason to. The more I organized my life around intention instead of expectation, the calmer I became. I slept better. I thought more clearly. Without constant requests, my nervous system had room to settle. And in that calm, I noticed something unsettling. No one asked why I'd changed. Not really. A few people made comments. Light ones, curious ones. But curiosity never turned into conversation. No one sat across from me and said, "You seem different. Are you okay?" Not without an agenda attached. That told me everything I needed to know. Because when someone matters to you beyond their function, you notice their absence as presence. You feel the shift as something worth understanding, not something to work around. I wasn't being missed. I was being worked around. And strangely, that clarity brought relief. I realized I had been carrying not just financial weight, but emotional insulation. I had protected people from the consequences of their own planning, their own assumptions. Without me smoothing things over, life became slightly less convenient. They adjusted. That adjustment was the point. I prepared quietly, not for confrontation, but for independence. True independence. The kind that doesn't require applause or permission. I updated my resume, explored opportunities, strengthened my network outside my family. I reminded myself that my identity was not tied to being needed by the same group of people forever. And I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Confidence. Not the loud kind. The kind that comes from alignment. From knowing that your actions match your values, even when no one is watching. They never noticed the shift because it didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic refusal. No emotional speech. Just a woman who stopped making herself endlessly accessible and used the space to reclaim herself. By the time anyone sensed that something fundamental had changed, it was already done. The reveal didn't come with excitement. There was no rush of adrenaline, no feeling of victory. Just a quiet moment of understanding, clear, sobering, and impossible to reverse once seen. It happened one evening as I was reviewing old records. Not because I was searching for proof of anything, but because I wanted closure with my own past decisions. I wanted to understand the full scope of what I had carried without naming it. When I added everything together, the number surprised me. Not because it was devastating, but because it was undeniable. 12 years of temporary help. 12 years of small transfers, emergency covers, short-term bridges that were never meant to be permanent. Each one is reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a structure. I wasn't just the emergency fund. I had been the silent sponsor of stability for people who never planned to build their own. That was the first layer of the reveal. The second layer was more personal. I realized that my value in the family had never been emotional leverage. It had been predictability. People didn't connect with me because I was open or expressive. They connected because I reduced uncertainty. And when uncertainty returned, the connection weakened. This wasn't betrayal. It was designed. I sat with that truth for a long time, let it settle. I didn't rush to reinterpret the past or rewrite memories. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. And clarity has a strange effect. It removes the urge to explain. I didn't need to confront anyone with the numbers. I didn't need acknowledgement. I didn't even need repayment. What I needed was alignment. I needed my future to stop being quietly structured around expectations I had never agreed to. The reveal wasn't that they had taken advantage of me. It was that I had allowed myself to disappear into usefulness because it felt safer than risking being unnecessary. That realization was humbling, but it was also freeing. I understood then that leverage doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it means knowing exactly where you stand and choosing not to stand there anymore. I had options. I could slowly reinsert myself into the old role once I found new work. I could restore the familiar rhythm, reassure everyone that things were back to normal, or I could let the silence stand. I could let people adjust to a version of me that didn't absorb impact by default, a version that required mutual effort to stay connected. And that choice, quiet, unannounced, was the most honest one I had ever made. I closed the notebook and put it away. The reveal wasn't something I shared. It was something I accepted. And once you accept the truth of a dynamic, you can't unknow it. You can't return to participating without awareness, without consent. I knew then that whatever came next would be irreversible. Not because it would be dramatic, but because it would be grounded. I wasn't preparing to leave in anger. I was preparing to stay whole. There's a moment after clarity where nothing happens. No action, no announcement, just the quiet weight of knowing that every option available to you will lead to a different life. And that once you choose, you won't be able to pretend you didn't. That was where I found myself. I had time, space, no immediate pressure to act, which meant the decision in front of me wasn't about urgency, it was about integrity. I saw 3 paths clearly. The first was the easiest. I could wait, find a new job, let my income return, allow the old expectations to slowly reattach themselves to me. I wouldn't even have to say yes out loud. My availability would speak for me. The family system would relax, things would feel normal again. But normal had a cost. I knew exactly what it would require of me. Selective amnesia, forgetting what the silence had shown me, pretending that usefulness and care were interchangeable, re-entering a role I now understood too well to inhabit comfortably. The second option was confrontation. I could sit everyone down, lay out the years, the numbers, the patterns, explain how things had felt from my side, ask for recognition, boundaries, maybe even change. That path had its own appeal. It promised clarity, a chance to be seen, but it also demanded emotional labor from me and accountability from people who had never asked for it. And deep down, I knew something was uncomfortable. If people need to be convinced to treat you with consideration, the relationship has already changed. The third option was quieter. I could change my behavior permanently without asking for permission or understanding. I could redefine my availability and let the relationships adjust or dissolve based on that reality. No speeches, no explanations, just alignment. That option scared me the most because it meant accepting whatever remained once I stopped compensating. It meant letting go of the illusion that I could manage other people's perception of me through effort. It meant choosing myself without making it a statement. I spent days sitting with that choice. I took long walks, wrote things down, imagined each outcome, not emotionally, but practically. Which version of my future felt sustainable? The answer was clear. I didn't want to be understood if understanding required me to cause pain. I didn't want an apology if it came from shock rather than reflection. And I didn't want normal back, not if normal required me to disappear again. So I chose the irreversible option. Not loudly, not with ceremony. I chose consistency. From that point forward, I decided that my availability would match my capacity, not others' expectations. That my generosity would be intentional, not assumed. That silence would no longer be something I filled out of habit. I didn't send a message announcing this decision. I simply lived it. And in doing so, I accepted a consequence many people avoid: being misunderstood. Some would see me as distant. Others have changed. A few are selfish. I let them. Because the version of me they preferred required my exhaustion. And I was done paying that price. The decision point wasn't about cutting anyone off. It was about cutting the cord between my worth and my usefulness. Once I made that choice, everything else became procedural and quiet. Once the decision was made, there was no emotional aftermath. That surprised me. I had expected guilt, doubt, second-guessing. Instead, what followed felt almost administrative, like closing tabs in a browser that had been draining power in the background for years. I moved carefully, quietly, with intention. There was no announcement that I was changing my life, no symbolic gesture anyone else could point to and say, "That's when she pulled away." From the outside, everything looked the same. I still showed up, still smiled, still listened. I just stopped compensating. The first thing I did was practical. I separated what had always been blurred under the word family. Accounts that had been loosely referenced as backup. Access that had been assumed rather than formally discussed. I clarified ownership, updated security, and removed ambiguity. Not in secret, just without fanfare. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just structure. For years, my financial life had been open by default because transparency felt like trust. Now I understand that transparency without boundaries becomes entitlement. So I rebuilt my systems to reflect something healthier. I also adjusted my calendar. I noticed how often my time had been treated as flexible simply because I didn't complain. I stopped rearranging plans to accommodate last-minute needs. I declined invitations that felt obligatory rather than connective. I chose rest without justifying it. No explanations. That was the key. The more I explained, the more people felt entitled to evaluate my reasons. So I didn't offer them. I can't make it. That doesn't work for me. I'm unavailable. Complete sentences, no emotional padding. People didn't like it, but they adapted. Slowly, I saw the consequences ripple outward. Someone else had to step in. Someone else had to figure it out. Small inconveniences appeared where I used to smooth them away. I let them exist, and still no one confronted me. That part was telling. Discomfort hovered at the edges of conversations, but no one wanted to name it, because naming it would require acknowledging that I had been holding more than my share, and that my withdrawal exposed a reliance no one wanted to own. So instead, people adjusted around me. I wasn't invited to problem-solving discussions anymore. My input was requested less. Decisions were made without my involvement. I noticed the absence, and I didn't chase it, because this time, absence wasn't punishment. It was alignment. Behind the scenes, my life was stabilizing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without a constant financial outflow, my savings grew. Without emotional labor draining me, my energy returned. I began working again, not urgently, but selectively, choosing roles that didn't require me to disappear to succeed. I felt balanced, And balance changes how you move through the world. You stop bracing. You stop anticipating collapse. You stop preparing to be needed. From the outside, I imagine it looked like I had simply become less involved. From the inside, it felt like I had come home to myself. Still, I knew something was coming. Systems don't like change, even quiet ones. And the longer I stayed consistent, the more pressure built where I used to absorb it. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed the difference between absence and refusal. But by then I was ready, because I hadn't moved in silence to avoid consequences. I had moved in silence so I could meet them calmly. Consequences rarely arrive the way we imagine. There was no single phone call, no dramatic accusation, no moment where someone finally said, "Why are you doing this to us?" What came instead was subtler and far more revealing. It started with confusion, small, quiet confusion that surfaced as friction in everyday moments. Plans that no longer came together smoothly, problems that lingered longer than they used to, decisions that felt heavier now that there was no obvious place to offload them. At first, people tried to solve things the old way, by reaching for me without fully reaching out. A delayed message, a vague hint dropped into conversation, a problem described carefully, without a direct ask, as if hoping I would volunteer. I didn't. And that's when confusion turned into discomfort. Because when a system loses a silent support, it doesn't collapse immediately. It wobbles. It tests the weight. It waits for the familiar correction that never comes. I could feel that waiting. In the pauses after messages went unanswered. In the way conversations slowed when money came up. In the subtle shift from certainty to hesitation whenever someone considered looping me in. I watched it happen without intervening. Not out of cruelty, but out of respect for the truth. For the first time, people were experiencing the real cost of the dynamic without my buffer in place. They were encountering the edges of their own planning, their own assumptions, their own reliance. And it was uncomfortable. I heard about it secondhand at first. Someone mentioned that my cousin was stressed about an expense that used to be easy. Another relative complained, not angrily, but wistfully, that things felt more complicated lately. No one connected the dots out loud, but I could see the shape of it clearly. When you remove a quiet stabilizer, everyone feels less stable, even if nothing else has changed. The next phase was irritation, not directed at me explicitly, but present in tone, in size, in offhand remarks about how things are different now or how everyone's busy these days. I noticed how often inconvenience was framed as a collective problem, without acknowledging the individual labor that had previously prevented it. There was a conversation one afternoon that crystallized the shift for me. We were all sitting together, and someone brought up an issue that would normally have landed in my lap without discussion. This time there was a pause. People looked at each other. Someone suggested an option that clearly wasn't ideal. And then, almost involuntarily, someone glanced at me. Not with entitlement, with hope. I met their eyes and waited. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I didn't offer a solution. I didn't rescue the moment. Eventually, someone else spoke. The problem moved on without me. I felt a strange mix of things then. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but confirmation. They were starting to feel the absence. And that feeling was doing work I had done for years. As time passed, the emotional tone shifted again. Confusion gave way to inconvenience. Inconvenience gave way to anxiety. Because when people realize a resource they relied on is no longer guaranteed, they don't immediately grieve it. They try to restore it. That's when the message is changed. "Hey, we haven't really talked in a while. Just wanted to check in. How are you doing these days? Miss you. We should catch up." On the surface, these looked like reconnections, but I noticed what they didn't say. They didn't ask why things had changed. They didn't acknowledge the shift. They didn't express curiosity about me as a person. The tone was exploratory, careful, like testing water temperature. I responded politely, warmly, briefly. I didn't offer more than was asked for, because I had learned something important. When people are used to accessing you through usefulness, intimacy often feels transactional without them realizing it. The moment that confirmed everything came unexpectedly. A relative called me late one evening, not in crisis, but close. They spoke carefully at first. Small talk, updates. Then slowly the conversation drifted toward a familiar problem. They didn't ask directly. They framed it as stress, as uncertainty, as not know what to do. I listened, and when the silence appeared, the one where I would normally step in, I let it stay. Finally, they sighed and said, "I guess things are just harder now that you're less involved." Less involved. Not gone, not unavailable, not setting boundaries, just less involved. As if my full participation had always been optional, but my labor essential. I felt something then, not anger, but a deep, quiet sadness. Because in that moment, it became clear that the loss they were experiencing wasn't relational. It was logistical. They weren't missing me. They were missing the ease my presence created. I acknowledged their stress without offering a solution. I said I hoped things worked out. I wished them well. We ended the call politely. After that, the dynamic shifted again. This time it was unmistakable. Distance. Invitations slowed. Messages became sporadic. Conversations felt careful, like people weren't sure what version of me they were dealing with anymore. Some stopped reaching out entirely. Others maintained a surface-level connection, but without depth. And a few, very few, seemed genuinely unsure how to relate to me without the old framework. I didn't chase any of them, because I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. When your presence was holding a system together, your withdrawal feels like disruption, even if it's healthy. People don't always react to change with reflection. Sometimes they react with avoidance. And that avoidance told me more than confrontation ever could. I had expected backlash. What I got instead was erosion. Slow, quiet, gradual. The kind of erosion that reveals what was actually structural and what was just convenient. I watched carefully as roles reshuffled. Someone else became the point of contact. Another relative tried to step into coordination. It didn't work the same way. Friction increased, expectations clashed, and for the first time, none of it was mine to manage. That realization brought a surprising sense of peace, because I could see now that my role hadn't been essential because I was uniquely capable. It had been essential because I was willing. And willingness, once withdrawn, exposes dependency verite. Quick, there was one final moment during this period that stayed with me. A family gathering where conversations flowed around me, but rarely toward me, where laughter happened without my involvement, where I felt unmistakably peripheral. And instead of feeling hurt, I felt free, because I wasn't being edged out. I was being released from a position I had outgrown. The consequences had begun, yes, but not for me, for the system that had relied on my silence more than my consent. By the time panic arrived, it was quiet. It didn't look like urgency. It looked like awkward warmth, like delayed concern, like people reaching for the past because the present no longer worked the way they expected it to. That's the thing about systems that rely on unspoken labor. No one notices the labor until it stops. And when they do, they don't immediately understand what they've lost. They just feel the friction. I could sense the shift before anyone said anything directly. Messages became longer, softer, filled with unnecessary details. People who hadn't reached out in months suddenly wanted to catch up. The tone wasn't accusatory. It was tentative, as if everyone were collectively feeling around for the edge of something they didn't know how to name. I didn't change how I responded. I stayed kind, polite, present, but I didn't re-enter. And that's when confusion turned into regret. Not expressed openly. Not yet. It appeared in small admissions, in half sentences that trailed off, in comments like, "I didn't realize how much you handled," or, "Things used to be easier when you were around more." Easier. The word carried weight, because what they were describing wasn't a connection. It was convenient. The comfort of having someone else absorb complexity so they wouldn't have to. I listened without correcting them, not because I agreed, but because it wasn't my job anymore to translate reality into something palatable. There was a moment when someone finally tried to rewind time. They suggested a fresh start, a vague idea of doing things differently, of communicating better, of not putting so much on one person. The language was careful, non-specific, safe. I nodded, said it sounded good, and then I waited, because a change that avoids naming the problem isn't change. It's maintenance. They wanted the version of me that functioned without requiring acknowledgement, the version that smoothed things over quietly and returned everything to equilibrium. What they didn't want was accountability. Not in a malicious way, but in a human one. Accountability is uncomfortable. It requires admitting that something worked because someone paid a cost you didn't notice. And by the time they were ready to notice, I had already stepped out of the role. There was no way back without me pretending I hadn't seen what I'd seen. That's what made it too late. Not because I was unwilling to reconnect, but because reconnecting under the old terms would require erasing my growth. I didn't want apologies delivered in hindsight. I didn't want appreciation born of loss. I didn't want to be valued retroactively. I wanted relationships that recognized effort while it was happening. And those couldn't be rebuilt from regret alone. The most difficult part was how gentle the regret was. No one accused me of anything. No one raised their voice. No one demanded I return to who I was before. They just hovered, waiting to see if I would. I didn't, because by then, I understood something fundamental. You can't fix a dynamic by asking the person who carried it to carry the repair too. That would just be another form of extraction. So I stayed consistent. I showed up as myself, not as a solution. I listened without solving. I offered presence without rescue. I let conversations end without filling the silence. And slowly, people stopped trying to fix it. Not because they didn't care, but because the cost of doing things differently was finally visible. Some relationships thinned, others faded. A few stabilized into something quieter, more equal. I accepted all of it, because fixing things isn't always about restoration. Sometimes it's about acceptance. And once you accept that certain versions of connection only exist when you're willing to disappear, there's no undoing that knowledge. By the time they were ready to talk about it honestly, I was already living honestly, and that made all the difference. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no rehearsed speeches, no dramatic reveal of feelings I'd been bottling up. It came in the form of a conversation that felt overdue, like a letter that had been written long ago, but only opened once its contents could no longer change anything. It happened during a quiet afternoon visit, just a few of us in the room. Coffee is cooling on the table. Neutral ground. Someone finally said it. "You've been different." Not accusing, not curious, just an observation. I nodded. There was a pause, the kind that invites explanation. The old version of me would have filled it immediately, clarifying, reassuring, minimizing. This time, I didn't. Eventually, another voice joined in. "We didn't realize how much pressure you were under before." That sentence hovered between apology and relief. I looked at them and felt something unexpected. Nothing. No surge of emotion. No need to defend myself. No urge to correct their phrasing or explain the years behind it. The absence of heat surprised even me. "I know," I said calmly. They waited, expecting more. I didn't give it, because the truth didn't require elaboration. Someone asked if I had been hurt. I considered the question carefully, not emotionally, but honestly. "I was tired," I said, "and I didn't know how to be anything else at the time." That was as close as I came to an admission. There was another pause. This one is heavier. They asked if I felt taken advantage of. I shook my head. I don't think anyone meant to, but intent isn't the same as impact. That landed quietly. I could see people shifting, not defensively, but uncomfortably. That discomfort wasn't mine to manage anymore. I didn't list examples. I didn't reference numbers. I didn't revisit old moments. I didn't ask for acknowledgement or change. Because confrontation isn't about unloading everything you've carried. It's about naming what's true now, and the truth was simple. I wasn't willing to return to who I had been. They asked what I wanted going forward. That question mattered more than anything else they had said. "I want relationships that don't depend on me fixing things," I said. "I want to be present without being responsible. No accusations, no conditions, just clarity." There was relief in that. For them, and for me, relief in knowing the terms. Relief in understanding that nothing had to be argued. Someone apologized then, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet acknowledgement that they hadn't noticed how much I carried. I accepted it, not because it fixed the past, but because it didn't try to erase it. We talked a little longer. About ordinary things, about the future, vaguely, about staying in touch. When the conversation ended, there was no dramatic closure, no promise of transformation, just a mutual understanding that something had shifted and would not be shifting back. As I left, I realized something important. Confrontation doesn't have to be explosive to be final. Sometimes the most powerful boundary is a calm one, and sometimes the absence of heat is proof that you've already healed. Who I am now is not the opposite of who I was before. That's important. I didn't become colder, I didn't harden, I didn't lose my instinct to help or my capacity for care. What changed wasn't my nature, it was my orientation. I stopped facing outward by default. For a long time, I thought growth meant learning how to give more efficiently, how to manage better, how to anticipate needs faster. I believe maturity was about becoming indispensable without complaint. Now I understand that maturity is knowing when your presence is additive and when it's extractive. These days, my life is quieter in ways that feel intentional. My calendar has space in it, my finances reflect my priorities, my relationships feel smaller, but clearer. I don't rush to fill the silence anymore. I let conversations breathe. I let people show me who they are without my intervention. Some do, some don't. I've learned not to take either personally. When someone asks for help now, I pause. Not performatively, naturally. I check in with myself before I respond. I ask whether help is wanted or expected, whether it's mutual or habitual. If I say yes, it's because I choose to. If I say no, it's without explanation. And the remarkable thing is, my nose doesn't feel heavy anymore. It feels accurate. I no longer measure my worth by how indispensable I am. I measure it by how aligned I feel when I wake up and when I go to sleep. There's a steadiness that comes from that alignment, a kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need reinforcement. My relationships reflect this change. A few people stayed, not because they needed me, but because they were willing to meet me differently. Those connections are slower, more deliberate, built on conversation instead of crisis. Others drifted. I let them, not with resentment, but with understanding. Some bonds only exist under certain conditions. When those conditions change, the bond dissolves. That doesn't make it false, it makes it finite. I'm okay with that now. I still show up for family, I still care, I still listen, but I no longer anchor the room. I take up space as myself, not as infrastructure. And in doing so, I've discovered something unexpected. When you stop overfunctioning, people don't always step up. But you step into yourself. You recover parts of your personality that had been quieted to maintain harmony. You find opinions you didn't voice, desires you postponed, limits you never named. I like who I am now. Not because I'm untouchable, but because I'm honest. I don't confuse love with obligation anymore. I don't mistake familiarity for closeness. And I don't disappear to keep things smooth. That doesn't make life easier. It makes it real. And real, I've learned, is more sustainable than any role I ever played. There's a quiet myth we're taught early in life that being strong means being endlessly available. That love proves itself through sacrifice. That if you can carry more, you should because others can't. It sounds noble, responsible, mature. But there's a cost to that myth that rarely gets discussed. When you make yourself endlessly useful, people stop relating to you and start relating to what you provide. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit. And habits left unexamined harden into expectations. I didn't lose my family when I stopped being the emergency fund. I lost the version of myself that only existed to keep everything running smoothly. And that loss, painful as it was, turned out to be necessary. Because here's the truth I learned too late, but not too late to matter. If your absence causes chaos, it doesn't mean you were valued. It means you were absorbing more than your share. Real connection doesn't disappear when you stop overfunctioning. It adjusts, or it reveals itself as something else entirely. And that revelation, however uncomfortable, is a form of emotional justice. Not the loud kind, not the punitive kind, the quiet kind, the kind where you don't need to explain yourself anymore, the kind where your life becomes lighter. Not because others approve, but because you're finally living in alignment with your limits. I don't regret helping. I regret not asking myself sooner why I believed love had to cost me invisibility. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, the reliable one, the fixer, the person everyone leans on, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to rest without collapsing everything. You are allowed to change without making a case for it. You are allowed to exist without being useful. And if some connections fade when you stop carrying them, that doesn't mean you failed. It means you finally set the weight down. I didn't end up alone. I ended up honest. And that made room for relationships that don't need me to disappear in order to function. Before I go, I want to leave you with one open question. Not rhetorical, not leading, just honest. Have you ever wondered who would still be there if you stopped being the one who holds everything together? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your experience in the comments. Not to compare pain, but to remind each other that quiet strength doesn't have to mean silent sacrifice. Thank you for listening.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.